Hello, my name's James Birchall, and in this video I'm going to show you how a DIALOGFLOW CX webhook works. Now, if you're like me, you've probably spent quite a bit of time digging around trying to figure out how this actually comes together. And one of the things I had noticed, like probably you did, is that there wasn't any single resource that actually pointed out how this worked. Now the good news is all the pieces that you needed to know are available to you. It was just a bit of a fragmented puzzle, and of course putting the puzzle together is really what we're going to show you in this video. Now, first things first, and I'm not going to belabor this point. I'm actually going to show this to you because I know you guys are smart and you're going to get this. As soon as I show this to you, you're going to be having a Homer Simpson moment. You're going to be going, oh, okay, I understand. So this is how it works. So we're in DIALOGFLOW CX, and this is a rinky-dink, really simple agent. And I've got some daft pick a number kind of page here. It's going to ask for two values, and then when the page values are completed, the route fires, and you're going to see that on the right, we've actually got enable webhook. Now, it's not really important where the webhook is because the whole point of this training video is to show you how webhooks work, not where you need to run them. Now, you can enable webhooks pretty much in loads of different places inside your bot, so we're not going to get into that. So I've got a basic webhook called my webhook. It's very original. Now, what's important is there's this thing called tag. Now, I couldn't find anything for the longest while that explained to me what this was for. I will tell you about that later. It's kind of cool. Anyway, so that's it. You basically name your webhook and you have a tag. And you think, and now what? What the heck do I do? Well, what you need to understand is when you call a webhook, and I'm going to go over to the manage page, and I'm going to go to webhooks, and I'm going to show you. I've got this really simple webhook called my webhook. I've left the timeout at 5 seconds. It's a generic web service. And there's my web address. And you're like, okay, cool. What else? Now, I've not enabled authentication. That's pretty much the same sort of thinking, no matter what you do. If you're dealing with APIs and you're passing information through, the intranet, you're going to need to deal with that. So that's sort of beyond the scope of this particular thing. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, it's not really relevant, at least for this piece. So we've got a webhook. Now it has to be an HTTPS and needs to be publicly available. Now I'm using a service called Data, and I'm not sure when you're watching this video, but DETA, Data, is a really cool new platform that I decided to start playing around with recently because I was getting tired of doing provisioning of my web applications the hard way. Anyway, we'll get to that in a sec. So here is the answer to your question, how does this work? It goes like this. When you call a webhook, all right, you're kind of going, where do I set the parameters? How does this work? Well, you don't need to worry about that, because what happens is when you call a webhook, a JSON object is passed as a part of the request, which is why I've got these two tabs up here. So basically what happens is that address that's assigned to that webhook is shoved a huge JSON object in the form of a request. Remember, it's a post, right? If you're calling a webhook, you tend to be doing a post. A get is a get, a post is a put. So this is a request, and it sends this Mongo object. Now, if you read the information here, it tells you exactly what this JSON object looks like. Now, I've actually created a real simple webhook over on the data service, and I wanted to show you what happens when the webhook is called. Take a look at this request. Look at this. Now, I didn't do anything here other than just run the it's called Visor. Visor is their debugging platform. You don't need to worry too much about data. I suggest you go pay them a visit, check them out. They're very cool, but you don't need to know too much about this right now. What you need to understand is when a webhook is called, a JSON object, a request object, is passed to the URL that you have, the endpoint that you have created. Remember, an endpoint is a web address plus an HTTP method. Now in this case the method is a post, so it's a put. And this is what the object looks like. If you look here, you can see a request, and it says detect response ID. Now if we go back and we take a look, you'll see it says detect response ID, string. If we come back over here, you'll see there's the string. Page info, current page, really long URL. Come back here, you'll see all this other stuff, intent information, fulfillment information. These are the possible parameters for this object. And now, by the way, this isn't absolute. This thing is dynamic. But what you need to understand is that when you call a webhook, the request object is passed over to your endpoint. And you need to grab. Now again, I'm using, over in my little magic world here, let me show you. I'm using PyCharm, and I just cranked up a fast API Python program just to really show you. So if you went to the address and you did a get, which is just typical sort of find the web address, you'd get hello world. But if you did a post, which is what a webhook call from Google DIALOGFLOW CX, this is what's going to happen. Now I haven't written any of the code in here because each and every one of you could write this differently. If you're using a different programming language, you're going to write it differently. So I didn't really want to get into this, but I want you to know this is what happens. A request object is passed to the endpoint. Now it says need to access the request object. Now of course I could do some weird stuff in here, and I mean this is Python. I could request dot, I don't know, JSON, I don't know, and I could set up a variable called data and do some stuff with that. Anyway, my point is this: if you actually get a handle on the request object, remember the request object looks like this, and it's a JSON object. Now if you're in Python, it's a dictionary, which means you can essentially just refer to the various keys to get the value. So that's how you access it. Notice I've passed a couple of parameters because I don't know if you paid any attention to what I'd actually created over in my rinky-dink agent. It was a magic sort of random number thing where I specified a minimum and a maximum number. So you could pull the parameters here from your webhook, and then you could go to town. So that's how you get the variable information over. You don't control it. You just call the webhook, and this really large JSON object called a request object, according to the webhook request protocol here, is sent to you. So you need to spend time looking through this to figure out what parts you want, and it explains it all very carefully in the DIALOGFLOW reference guide. Now that's great. So that's how the information gets sent to the webhook. So you can take it apart at the webhook end. You saw the code, and like I showed you my rinky-dink little thing, and then eventually when you're done, you need to send back a response object. So a request object is sent to the webhook, a response object is sent back. Now the response object follows that protocol. So let me scoop down. You'll see in the direction in the documentation here and here, you need to send back a JSON object. So you can either build it manually, you can use whatever tools and tricks you have to your heart's content, but you're building an object that looks like this. And as you can see right now, for instance, it says fulfillment response, and it says object fulfillment response. And of course, object is in more text. If you look down here, it'll say, where is it? Fulfillment response. It says it's an object. If we click on that, it will drive through. It is nothing more than a glorified name value pair, a JSON object, okay? And you need to make sure that you simply put the right key and the right value into this text object that you build, which you then pass back as a JSON object. Now when you pass it back as a JSON object, it goes back to the DIALOGFLOW, and then DIALOGFLOW knows how to interpret it, and it pulls all the parts out and it uses it accordingly. So you don't have to do anything other than manipulate the request on the way over and rebuild the response and pass it back. That is how these webhooks work. If you do that, and by the way, this is my rinky-dink response object because I didn't really take the request object apart, you'll see I pass that back. So that is typically how it works. So as they say in the TLDR, too long didn't read, or the summary, when you call a webhook, Dialogflow passes a request object that looks like this, filled with all of the information from your agent. You get to grab it and manipulate it however you want. I happen to be using PyCharm. I happen to be playing around with here, and you can see it's a very simple fast API. And it says, you've got to grab the request object, which is what comes in. You got to take it apart by referencing the elements, the keys and the values. You've got to rebuild. Once you've done your math and your logic and look up your database or check your values or whatever the heck it is you want to do, you build that up, and then finally you build a response, and then you pass it back. And if you pass back a response that actually follows this format, then all the bits and pieces that you put into these fields will be automatically picked up by Dialogflow, and your bot will behave that way. That's how it works. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this is incredibly elegant. You don't do anything with a web request. It creates the webhook request JSON model and sends it over. All you got to do is grab a handle on the JSON request object, take it apart, grab what you want, do whatever logic you were planning on doing, and rebuild this, and then pass it back. And then your bot will carry on trucking. Anyway, hopefully that explains it to you now, because the moment the penny dropped for me was when I saw all of this. I'm like, OMG. Anyhow, my name's James Birchall. This has been a quick how-to video on how Dialogflow CX uses the webhook the request and the response. If you got any questions, by all means, reach out to me. You can find me on social media. And you guys have a fantastic day. You take care now. Bye-bye.